The grand ballroom of the Lexington Hotel shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Rows of pristine white roses lined the aisle, their fragrance mingling with the scent of expensive champagne and the delicate notes of a live string quartet. Every detail had been meticulously planned, down to the hand-stitched lace on Isabel Monroe's designer gown and the imported silk napkins folded into perfect swans on each table. This was no ordinary wedding. This was a high society event, the kind that graced the pages of the New York Times and Vanity Fair. Ethan Caldwell stood at the altar, his broad shoulders squared, his face composed. He had conquered boardrooms, built an empire, and amassed a fortune that most could only dream of. Marrying Isabel was the next logical step, a union that made sense on paper. She was poised, sophisticated, and came from one of the most influential families in the city. The officiant cleared his throat, preparing to begin, when suddenly, the heavy double doors at the far end of the room slammed open. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, whispers rose, and a few guests even chuckled, assuming it was an elaborate wedding prank. But as the small figure marched forward, determination in his step, the laughter faded into hushed curiosity. A boy, no older than 7, strode down the aisle with the confidence of someone 3 times his size. He was breathless, his messy dark hair sticking to his forehead as if he had been running. His sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor, an unmistakable contrast to the elegant scene before him. He came to an abrupt stop just feet from the altar, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, he shouted, "How could you forget about Mommy?" A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. A few guests exchanged bewildered glances. Someone let out a nervous laugh, but it died quickly as all eyes darted toward Ethan. At first, Ethan didn't move. His carefully maintained composure faltered for the first time in years. His breath caught. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew exactly who this boy was. A child. A son. His son. Isabel's grip on her bouquet tightened. Her knuckles turned white. "Ethan," she hissed under her breath, barely maintaining her smile. "Who is this?" The boy, Lucas, stood his ground. His chin lifted defiantly. "I'm Lucas," he declared. "And he pointed straight at Ethan, "is my dad." A stunned silence fell over the room. A reporter in the back of the ballroom discreetly raised his phone, already recording. The murmurs grew louder. Isabel's patience snapped. With a furious glare, she turned to Ethan, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "Fix this. Now." But Ethan couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know how. The once celebratory atmosphere of the wedding had dissolved into stunned silence. The grand chandeliers still sparkled, the white roses still lined the aisle, but the moment Lucas spoke, everything changed. Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire who prided himself on control, stood frozen at the altar. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, but deep down, he already knew. He looked at the boy standing before him, messy dark hair, striking blue eyes, a defiant set to his jaw. The resemblance was unmistakable. Lucas crossed his arms, unfazed by the hundreds of high society guests staring at him. "You don't even remember me, do you?" His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it. A hushed murmur swept through the room. A few guests exchanged looks, whispers turning into speculation. Reporters near the back didn't even pretend to be discreet anymore. This was a scandal unfolding in real time. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him like a vice. Isabel Monroe, his now former bride, wasn't as paralyzed. She turned to him, her voice clipped and cold. "Ethan," she said through clenched teeth, "tell me this isn't true." But Ethan couldn't. Because it was true. Lucas let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised. You forgot about her too." A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the crowd. The murmurs turned into full conversations, hushed but relentless. "Her?" Isabel demanded, her composure cracking. "Who is her?" Lucas squared his shoulders. "My mom." His expression darkened. "Sophia Bennett." The name landed like a bomb in the middle of the wedding. Ethan felt the air rush from his lungs. Sophia. He hadn't heard that name in years, but it still carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. Victoria Whitmore, an influential guest sitting in the front row, leaned toward her husband, whispering, "I remember her. She and Ethan were inseparable back in college. They were in love." Another guest, a well-known real estate mogul, let out a low whistle. "And now she's got a kid. This is getting interesting." Ethan barely registered the voices around him. His mind was stuck in the past, flashing back to late nights in a tiny apartment, Sophia laughing under dim kitchen lights, the promises they had made but never kept. He swallowed hard and took a step toward Lucas. "Who brought you here?" Lucas met his gaze without flinching. "I came by myself." Gasps rippled through the room. A child, barely 7, had crashed a billionaire's wedding alone? A security team member in a black suit and earpiece stepped forward, ready to escort Lucas out. No, the word left Ethan's mouth before he even realized it. The guards hesitated. "Let him talk," Ethan said, his voice firmer this time. Lucas lifted his chin. "So, you do have a voice," he said, unimpressed. A few nervous chuckles from the guests quickly died down. Isabel, however, was done. She exhaled sharply, stepping back from Ethan. "This is humiliating," she hissed before turning on her heel and walking away, her expensive silk train dragging behind her. The officiant, clearly unsure of what to do, awkwardly shuffled his notes. The wedding was over before it had even begun. But Ethan wasn't thinking about Isabel. He was looking at the boy in front of him. His son. And for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't care about the wedding, the guests, or the scandal. He had bigger things to fix. Ethan Caldwell had spent his life making billion-dollar decisions without hesitation. He had built an empire, crushed competitors, and thrived under pressure. Yet now, as he stood in front of a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of Chicago, his confidence wavered. The red brick building was a far cry from the towering glass skyscrapers and luxury penthouses he was used to. The paint on the front door was chipped, the iron railings rusted with time, and the small stoop was lined with a few potted plants that had seen better days. Lucas didn't hesitate. He marched up the steps like he had done it 100 times before, knocking 3 times in quick succession. The door creaked open, and there she was. Sophia Bennett. For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. She wasn't the same woman he had walked away from all those years ago. The Sophia he remembered was full of fire and ambition, her laughter infectious, her dreams as big as his own. But the woman standing before him now, she looked exhausted, her once bright hazel eyes dull with fatigue, dark circles shadowing her face. She took one look at Ethan and exhaled sharply. "Lucas," she said, her voice tinged with warning. "I told you not to do this." Lucas, unfazed, shrugged. "Yeah, well, you also told me to eat vegetables, and we both know how that turned out." Sophia shot him a look, then turned her attention back to Ethan. Her grip tightened on the doorframe, as if she needed it to steady herself. "Why are you here, Ethan?" Ethan opened his mouth, but the words felt foreign on his tongue. Where did he even begin? Lucas didn't wait for him to figure it out. "I told him," he announced, arms crossed. "About you. About me." Sophia closed her eyes for a fraction of a second before reopening them. "Of course, you did." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, years of distance, and the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Ethan finally found his voice. "You never told me," he said, quieter than he intended. Sophia let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "Would it have changed anything?" "Yes." She studied him, skepticism written all over her face. "Would it, Ethan? You were so focused on your career, on your company. Would you have given any of it up?" Ethan swallowed hard. The truth? Back then, he wasn't sure he would have. But now? Now, the sight of his son standing beside him, the quiet but unmistakable look of disappointment in Sophia's eyes, made him want to rewrite every bad decision he had ever made. "I didn't know," he said, his voice thick. Sophia's expression softened, just for a second, before she straightened her shoulders. "Well, you do now." Ethan took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Lucas told me you're sick." Her jaw tightened. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity." He paused. "It's concern." She hesitated. Lucas, who had been watching the exchange like a tennis match, finally spoke up. "Mom, we need help. You can pretend we don't, but we do." Sophia's fingers twitched at her side. It was clear she hated this, hated feeling vulnerable, hated that her son had gone behind her back. Ethan took a step closer. "Let me help, Sophia." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at Lucas, her son, their son, and for the first time that evening, Ethan saw something crack in her armor. She was tired. She was so tired. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled and stepped aside. "Come in." And just like that, the door opened, not just to the apartment, but to everything Ethan had missed. Ethan Caldwell had signed more contracts than he could count. He had brokered multi-million-dollar deals, negotiated with the toughest CEOs, and built an empire from the ground up. Yet, sitting across from Lucas Bennett at a small, worn-out kitchen table, he realized something: business was easy, parenting was not. It started with the small things. The first time Ethan picked Lucas up from school, he arrived in a sleek black Bentley, expecting to impress the boy. Instead, Lucas took one look at the car, wrinkled his nose, and muttered, "Subtle." At dinner, Ethan assumed the best way to bond was over a 5-star meal, so he ordered from a Michelin-starred restaurant and set the table with fine china. Lucas, however, ignored the steak, barely touched the imported vegetables, and instead asked for macaroni and cheese. The boxed kind. Ethan had never made macaroni and cheese in his life. By the time he figured it out, nearly burning the cheese sauce in the process, Lucas had already finished a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, giving him a look that could only be described as deeply unimpressed. "You might be good at business," Lucas said, pushing the untouched bowl away, "but you're terrible at being normal." It wasn't just the food. It was everything. Ethan was used to structured schedules, power meetings, and controlled environments. Lucas, however, was a whirlwind of energy, sarcasm, and completely unpredictable questions. One night, while helping with homework, Lucas suddenly blurted out, "How rich are you, exactly?" Ethan set down the math book. "Why?" Lucas shrugged. Just wondering if you're island rich or private jet rich." Ethan smirked. "Both." Lucas whistled. "Wow. And yet, you can't make mac and cheese." Despite the rough start, something shifted. Ethan began showing up. He learned that Lucas hated waking up early, so he started making pancakes on weekends, badly at first, until Lucas finally took over. He found out that Lucas loved baseball, so he bought 2 mitts and suggested they play catch, which ended with Ethan getting hit in the stomach more than once. He even tried fixing a leaky faucet in Sophia's apartment, which resulted in the entire kitchen getting sprayed with water, much to Lucas' absolute delight. And then came the calendar incident. One Friday morning, Ethan's assistant called in a panic. "Sir, your entire weekend has been cleared from your schedule." Ethan frowned. "I didn't authorize that." Well, his assistant hesitated. "We received a rather direct call from someone claiming to be your son." Ethan blinked. "Lucas?" "Yes," he said, and I quote, "My dad is busy being a real dad this weekend. Cancel everything. Bye." Ethan should have been furious. Instead, he laughed. Because for the first time in his life, he realized Lucas didn't just want a father who provided. He wanted a father who stayed. For most of his life, Ethan Caldwell defined success by numbers, profit margins, stock values, and the relentless pursuit of growth. He was a man who never wasted a second, who operated on strict schedules, who measured his worth by how efficiently he could build and expand his empire. But now, as he stood in Sophia's tiny kitchen, sleeves rolled up, attempting to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich under Lucas' unimpressed gaze, he realized something: success meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. At first, the changes were small. Instead of his usual 6 a.m. boardroom meetings, he started his mornings by walking Lucas to school. It was a short walk, just 6 blocks, but in that time, he learned things he never would have in an office. Lucas talked about school, his favorite cartoons, the baseball card collection he was trying to build, and the elaborate plan he had to convince his teacher that reading comic books should count as literature. One day, as they passed a local coffee shop, Lucas looked up at him. "So, you're actually doing this, huh?" Ethan glanced down. "Doing what?" "Being a dad." Lucas kicked a loose rock on the sidewalk. "I thought you'd give up by now." The words hit Ethan harder than they should have. Because Lucas had every reason to believe he would leave again. That night, Ethan canceled an important dinner with investors to help Lucas build a model rocket for his school project. The glue got everywhere, the instructions made no sense, and at one point, Lucas dramatically declared that NASA would never hire them. But when they finally finished, a slightly crooked but functional rocket sitting proudly on the table, Lucas grinned up at him. "Okay," he admitted. "That was kinda cool." Ethan smirked. Progress. But the real moment of change came when Sophia got worse. One evening, while Ethan was helping Lucas with homework, she collapsed in the kitchen. Panic surged through him as he caught her before she hit the floor. She was conscious, but barely. Her breathing was shallow, her skin too pale. Ethan didn't hesitate, he scooped her up and rushed her to the hospital. Lucas sat beside him in the waiting room, small shoulders tense, hands curled into fists. "She always says she's fine," he muttered, voice small. Ethan placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "She's not alone anymore." And for the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't just staying for Lucas. He was staying for her, too. When Sophia finally woke up, weak but stable, she looked at him. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Ethan met her gaze. "Yes," he said, voice steady. I do." The lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its surface reflecting the golden hues of autumn. Crisp leaves crunched beneath Ethan's boots as he stood near the dock, watching Lucas skip stones across the water. Sophia sat a few feet away on a worn picnic blanket, sipping tea from a travel mug. She looked healthier than she had weeks ago, but there was still a quiet exhaustion in her eyes, a heaviness she tried to hide. Ethan had brought them here on a whim, remembering how she once told him, "This lake is my favorite place in the world." Back then, they had been college kids with nothing but cheap gas station coffee, grand dreams, and the belief that love was enough. Now, life had reshaped them. They weren't those kids anymore. Lucas, ever the curious one, had been rummaging through an old duffel bag from Sophia's closet, looking for extra blankets. But instead of finding fabric, he found something else, something that made the world tilt slightly off balance. A small velvet ring box. "Hey, Mom," Lucas called out, holding up the box. "You, planning to get married anytime soon?" Sophia nearly spilled her tea. "Lucas." Ethan's breath caught as Lucas, oblivious to the weight of what he had just done, flipped open the box. Inside sat the engagement ring Ethan had given her all those years ago, simple, elegant, untouched by time. "You kept it," Ethan said softly, stepping forward. Sophia pressed her lips together, looking anywhere but at him. "I meant to pawn it years ago." "But you didn't." She sighed, closing the box gently. "I told myself I would, but I don't know. Maybe I was holding on to something that didn't exist anymore." Ethan hesitated, then reached out, taking the box from her hand. He knelt down, the damp earth cool beneath his knee, and held the ring up, not as a grand gesture, but as an honest one. Lucas' eyes went wide. "Whoa. Are we doing this right now?" Ethan chuckled. "I think we are." Sophia stared at him, wary. "Ethan." He met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "I know what you're thinking, that this is impulsive, that I'm trying to fix the past with one moment." He shook his head. "I'm not." She swallowed hard. Ethan exhaled. "I left once, and that was the biggest mistake of my life. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I don't want to just be Lucas' father. I want to be your husband." Sophia's defenses flickered, the walls she had carefully built showing the smallest cracks. Lucas, standing nearby, folded his arms dramatically. "Just saying, Mom, if you say no, this is gonna be super awkward." A laugh bubbled past Sophia's lips, unguarded and real. She looked down at Ethan, at the man who had changed, who had fought for their family. Slowly, she took the ring from his hand, turning it over in her palm before slipping it onto her finger. Then, finally, she whispered, "Yes." The sun hung low over the lake, casting a golden glow across the still water. The same lake where everything had changed, where Lucas had found the ring, where Sophia had finally said yes. Now, it would witness something even more profound. Ethan Caldwell stood at the edge of the dock, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. There was no grand ballroom, no $1,000 floral arrangements, no swarm of reporters documenting the event. Instead, there were just close friends, family, and the gentle sound of water lapping against the wooden beams. Lucas, standing proudly beside him, straightened his small bow tie for the 5th time. "You sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, smirking. Ethan chuckled, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm pretty sure." "Good," Lucas nodded, then whispered, "because if you mess this up, you'll have to deal with me." Ethan smiled. Somehow, this moment, small, intimate, imperfect, felt more right than anything he had ever done. The guests were seated on simple wooden chairs, their laughter light and genuine. Sophia had insisted on a small wedding, something real, without the pressure of status or spectacle. It had been Ethan's first true test, learning that love wasn't about grandeur, but about showing up, day after day, for the people who mattered. And then, she appeared. Sophia stepped onto the dock, wearing a simple white dress that caught the breeze, her dark hair falling in soft waves. There was no extravagant veil, no sparkling tiara, just her, radiant and breathtaking. Ethan felt his breath hitch. He had seen her 1,000 times before, but never quite like this. Never as the woman he was about to marry, not as the future he had nearly lost. Lucas whispered, "Breathe, Dad," before stepping aside. As Sophia reached Ethan, she smiled, not the guarded smile she used to wear, but one full of quiet certainty. The officiant, an old family friend of Sophia's, cleared his throat. "We gather here today, not for spectacle, but for something much simpler, a promise." Sophia and Ethan held hands as they exchanged vows, words not of perfection, but of understanding. "I promise," Sophia said softly, "to let you prove to me, every day, that this time, you're staying." Ethan squeezed her hands. "And I promise that I will." There was no lavish orchestra, just a friend playing soft guitar in the background, no roaring applause, just the warmth of those who truly cared. When they kissed, Lucas let out a triumphant whoop, nearly dropping the ring pillow in his excitement. Laughter rippled through the guests, and Ethan found himself laughing too, something he had forgotten how to do until he met Lucas. They weren't perfect, but they were a family. And as the sun dipped below the trees, Ethan realized, for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing something bigger. He already had everything he needed. The house wasn't a mansion. It didn't have sweeping staircases, marble floors, or a skyline view. But it was a home. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell understood the difference. The small suburban house had a front porch with a swing, where Sophia liked to drink her morning coffee. The kitchen smelled of pancakes on Saturdays, even though Ethan still struggled not to burn them. In the living room? It was always just a little messy, thanks to Lucas' ever-growing collection of baseball cards, comic books, and half-finished science projects. Ethan never thought he'd love a home filled with chaos, laughter, and the occasional sticky peanut butter handprint on the fridge, but now, he couldn't imagine life any other way. One evening, after a long day, Ethan came home to find Lucas sprawled out on the couch, watching a baseball game and eating cheese crackers directly from the box. Lucas barely looked up. "Took you long enough." Ethan smirked, tossing his jacket over the chair. "Didn't realize I had a curfew." "You do now." Lucas grinned. "Mom said no work calls at dinner." Ethan sighed, shaking his head. Old habits died hard. He had spent years believing that success meant never slowing down, never stopping for a break. But now, he was learning that sometimes, the most important thing wasn't the next deal, it was sitting on the couch with his son, watching a game, and passing him the cheese crackers. Sophia walked in a moment later, drying her hands with a kitchen towel. "Dinner's almost ready," she called over her shoulder. "And no, Ethan, it's not from a 5-star restaurant." Ethan chuckled. "I've been reformed." Lucas snorted. "Sure you have." But deep down, Ethan knew he had changed. He no longer checked his phone every 5 minutes. He had stopped measuring his worth by his bank account. And instead of planning board meetings, he planned weekend trips with Lucas and Sophia, small road trips, fishing weekends, backyard barbecues. One afternoon, he was helping Sophia fix a leaky faucet, successfully, this time, when she looked up at him with that soft, knowing smile. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" she asked. Ethan wiped his hands on a dish towel. "Doing what?" "Being one of us." He paused. It was a simple statement, but it meant everything. Sophia had spent years believing that he would always choose work, that he would always put ambition before love. But he had changed, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Ethan leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I was always meant to be one of us." From the next room, Lucas called out, "Hey, lovebirds, if dinner gets cold, I'm eating both your portions." Ethan laughed, really laughed. Because this was life. Messy. Imperfect. Real. And for the first time, he wasn't chasing something bigger. He already had it. Life often teaches us that success isn't measured by wealth, status, or accomplishments, but by the people we choose to love and the time we give to them. Ethan Caldwell spent years chasing an empire, believing that financial security was the key to happiness. But in the end, he realized that true success is found in family, in the simple moments, and in the relationships we nurture. For many, it's easy to get caught up in responsibilities, to believe that providing financially is enough. But as we grow older, we come to understand that showing up matters more than anything money can buy. Lucas never needed a billionaire father, he needed a father who was present. And Sophia didn't need extravagant gestures, she needed someone who would stand by her, even in the difficult moments. This story reminds us that it's never too late to make things right. Mistakes don't define us, it's what we do afterward that truly matters. No matter how much time has passed, we always have the power to choose love over pride, connection over distance, and family over personal ambition. For those in their later years, this message is even more profound. Life moves fast, but relationships are what remain. No one looks back and wishes they had worked more, but many wish they had loved more. If there is someone in your life you've drifted away from, a child, a sibling, an old friend, reach out. Because at the end of the day, what we build in the hearts of those we love is the only legacy that truly lasts.